All right, let's dive into something that can either make you feel like a compose master or have you reaching for the bug spray. Side effects.
Oh yeah, side effects.
We're talking about those moments when you're building a beautiful UI, everything's nice and declarative.
All smooth sailing.
And then, bam, you need to make a network call or maybe whip up a little snack bar action.
It's like, oh right, my app actually has to do stuff, real world stuff, not just look pretty.
Exactly. And those things, those actions that reach beyond just what the user sees, that's our side effect territory.
Right, because it's not just about updating pixels on the screen anymore.
So today, we're figuring out how Compose helps us wrangle those side effects, keep them from turning our code into a tangled mess.
Because, let's be real, nobody wants to debug that. The goal is to make those side effects play nicely with Compose's whole reactive vibe.
Okay, so let's talk strategy. One of the first things you'll probably run into in the Compose world is launched effect.
Ah, yes, launched effect.
Seems like the go-to solution for a lot of common situations.
Absolutely. Think of launched effect as your trusty sidekick for anything that's got to happen in sync with a composable's lifecycle.
Okay, so very tightly coupled.
Yeah, like when a screen appears, you need to fetch some data. Launched effect. Want to trigger a one-time animation? Launched effect. It's there for you.
So something like showing a welcome back snack bar when Composable pops up, perfect use case for launch effect.
Spot on. Launch effect will kick off a coroutine when your composable enters the composition. And here's the important part. It'll make sure that coroutine is canceled when the composable goes away.
Cleanup crew.
Exactly. No snack bars hanging around when they shouldn't be.
Now, you mentioned coroutines. What about when I have something that's not a quick in and out operation, say an animation that needs to run as long as the user's on that screen? Can launched effect handle that? Or are we talking a different tool for the long-running stuff?
You're thinking about those longer processes. That's good. Launched effect can handle both. You can actually use suspending functions like delay right inside of it.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, there's even an example in the documentation, a pulsing animation, all done within a launched effect, using delay to control that pulse.
Wait, hold on. So we can have delays, network calls, all that asynchronous goodness bundled up inside this lifecycle aware function?
That's the power of launched effect. It bridges that gap between your composable's lifecycle and all those side effects that often happen, well, asynchronously.
That's wild. I'm already rethinking how I'd approach certain things. But what about situations where I might need to launch coroutines, but I don't need them tied quite so tightly to a specific composable?
Okay, I see where you're going with this.
Like, let's say I start an animation when a user taps a button, but I want that animation to potentially outlive that button's composable.
You're thinking ahead. That's good.
Is there a different tool for that kind of scenario?
You're right. Sometimes you need a bit more control over those coroutine life cycles. That's where Remember Coroutine Scope comes in.
Okay, remember Coroutine Scope. I've seen that name, but it's always felt a bit mysterious. Demystify it for me.
Sure. So Remember Coroutine Scope. Think of it like this dedicated coroutine scope that's connected to a particular spot in your UI. You can launch coroutines within it, and Compose will make sure they're handled gracefully, even if.
Even if what?
Even if the composable that originally launched them, maybe using that button click you mentioned, even if that composable disappears, those coroutines can keep going.
So I could have a coroutine triggered by a button click that continues even after the user navigates to a different screen.
Exactly. It gives you that fine-grained control. You decide, let the animation finish, pause it, cancel it based on your app's logic.
So with Remember Coroutine Scope, I'm really in the driver's seat.
You got it. You have the power.
This is really showing how flexible Compose is when it comes to these side effects. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach.
Not at all. And we're just getting started. There are even more tools up our sleeve for those really specific situations. When you need that fine-grained control over how your side effects behave.
We've talked about launching effects with Launched Effect, managing those coroutines with Remember Coroutine Scope. But this is Compose, so I'm guessing there's more, right? Especially for those cases where things get a bit, tricky.
Of course. Compose loves a good challenge.
Yeah.
And you're right, there are times when you want an effect to do its thing, but not go into overdrive every time a single value changes. That's where Remember Updated State steps in.
Okay, now you're speaking my language. It's like telling the side effect, hey, just chill out. Once is enough. Don't get all worked up about every little update.
Exactly. Picture this. You've got this cool splash screen. After a few seconds, bam, you're in the app.
Seamless transition. Love it.
Right. But imagine something triggers a recomposition while that timer's going. You don't want the user stuck in the loop, endlessly bouncing back to the splash screen.
Talk about a user experience nightmare. So remember, updated state comes to the rescue.
It's the hero we need. It guarantees that the action linked to the state in this case, that navigation only happens once, that initial state, that's all that matters. Even if things recompose, remember updated state is like, nope, already handled it, moving on.
It's almost like giving your side effect a memory so it doesn't freak out and start from scratch with every recomposition.
Exactly. And get this, you don't even lose that reactive goodness. Your composable can update other parts of the UI no problem, but that specific side effect, like our navigation, that stays in check.
That's some seriously smart engineering. Sometimes I forget how much thought goes into making sure Compose can handle the predictable and the unpredictable with style.
The Compose team, they think of everything. Speaking of handling things gracefully, though, we can't forget about cleanup. Animations, network calls, listeners, all those things we set up, we've got to make sure they're released properly.
Right, we don't want to be responsible for memory leaks or, worse, crashing someone's app. What's the Compose approach to cleaning up after those side effects?
That's where our good friend Disposable Effect comes in. It's the ultimate cleanup crew, making sure nothing's left behind when a composable calls it a day.
Disposable effect? I like the sound of that already. So how does this cleanup crew operate?
It's all about the onDispose function. When you set up a disposable effect, you give it a block of code to run when that composable exits or its keys change. Inside that block, that's where you do your cleanup. Unregister listeners, cancel those lingering coroutines, close connections, you name it.
So if I'm using a location listener, I'd use disposable effect to unregister it when the user's done with that screen. Keep things tidy.
Exactly, being a good Android citizen. In
Mhm.
fact, the documentation, they use a great example with analytics. You can use disposable effect with a lifecycle observer to send those screen started and screen ended events without leaving things running in the background.
Disposable effect is starting to sound like my new favorite Compose function. It's like having a personal assistant for managing all those side effect life cycles.
It's a real lifesaver, especially as your app starts to get more complex. And speaking of complexity, we've been talking about managing things within Compose. But what about all those tools and libraries that live outside of the Compose world?
Right. Flows, live data, external SDKs, all that good stuff. How do we bridge that gap?
Well, Compose wouldn't be Compose without some tricks up its sleeve, right? You have side effect and produce state.
Two more tools. Okay, you're spoiling us. Let's start with side effect. What's its superpower? Okay, two tools for bridging, Compose to, well, everything else our apps like to do. Side effect and produce state, those are the ones, right? Let's unpack them. Side effect first. What's its deal?
Side effect, that's your direct line from the Compose world to the outside.
The outside, meaning...
We've been talking about keeping side effects under wraps, right? Managing them within your world, Compose's whole recomposition life cycle. But sometimes you need to tap into something external, let it know what's up. Side effect is how you do that.
Like sending a little message in a bottle. Hey, external systems, anything out there? If you care about what my Compose UI is doing, here's the latest.
Perfect analogy. A common example is updating things like user properties in analytics. Say you've got a news app, right?
Love those.
And you want to keep track of what categories the user's into. Every time they tweak their preferences in your Compose UI, Side Effect can send that update straight to your analytics backend.
Keeps everything in sync without messing with the Compose flow.
Nice. So if Side Effect is about sending stuff out, Produce State is for bringing stuff in.
You're on a roll. Produce state, that's your key to taking things like flows, live data streams, even those ArcsJava observables, and making them feel at home in Compose.
Ah, like a universal translator for reactive streams. And any kind of stream, or are there limits? Pretty versatile. The documentation, they've got this cool example, loading an image from the network using Produce State. You basically represent that whole loading state. You know, in progress, success, maybe an error popped up, you represent it all as Compose state. Makes managing that whole process in your UI super clean.
And image loading, that's where those reactive streams really shine, so it's great that Compose handles them so well. Now, before we got really into side effect and produce state, you were about to tell us about a couple more tools, right? Something about performance optimization, reactive stuff, or did I dream that part up?
Compose is full of these hidden gems, little things that can make a big difference in how your app performs and how maintainable your code is. Derived state of, that's one of them.
Derived state of, okay, sounds important. What's the secret sauce?
Remember how Compose is all about recomposition. figuring out the most efficient way to update what the user sees.
Right, smart UI updates.
Exactly. But sometimes you have these values, they depend on other state variables, and they might trigger recomposition even if the UI itself wouldn't actually change.
Extra work for no reason.
Exactly. Derived state of, that's where it comes in. It lets you say, hey, compose, only recalculate this if it actually matters to what the user sees.
So, like, don't sweat the small stuff.
You got it. Imagine a scrolling list. You only want to scroll to top button to show up if the user has scrolled past a certain point.
Makes sense.
The scroll position, that might change a lot, but the button, it only needs to appear or disappear when they hit that threshold. Derived state of lets you optimize for that. No unnecessary recomposition.
Clever. You're basically making a super smart state variable, one that only updates when it absolutely has to. That could be a lifesaver as UIs get more complex, but it feels like one of those things that could be easy to overuse. Any gotchas with derived state of.
You're right to be cautious. The Compose docs actually warned about this. Don't use derived state of if you're just combining two regular state values. You're just adding overhead you don't need. Derived state of is at its best when you've got some logic, some calculation that needs to happen before you decide if recomposition is necessary.
So use it strategically, not a band-aid for everything, but a powerful tool when you need that fine-grained control. Now, you mentioned reactive programming earlier. We talked about produce state for bringing streams into Compose, but what about the other way around? Reacting to Compose state changes with something like flows.
Ah, you're thinking about snapshot flow. That one's for the flow fans.
Okay, tell me more. What can I do with this snapshot flow magic?
Let's say you want to track how users are scrolling through a really long list. Maybe for analytics, maybe to load in more content as they go.
Right, got to keep things smooth.
With snapshot flow, you can watch the scroll state of a lazy column and turn those changes into a stream of values, a flow. And once you're in the flow world, you can do all sorts of cool stuff. Filter, map, combine it with other streams. The possibility is kind of endless.
So snapshot flow is like this bridge between how Compose thinks about state and the power of Kotlin flows.
Exactly. You can react to those state changes in Compose in a super granular way and integrate seamlessly with any other part of your app that's using flows.
Wow, we've covered a lot in this deep dive. Started with the basics of what a side effect even is in Compose and ended up with this whole toolkit for managing them like pros.
That's what's so great about Compose, right? It gives you the power and flexibility to handle all those real-world scenarios without throwing the elegance of declarative UI out the window.
It really does. So to all our listeners who are out there building awesome stuff with Compose, remember this toolkit. Experiment, play around, find what works best for your app.
And if you discover some really clever way to use these side effect tools, or if you run into a challenge, let us know. Share it on the forum. Let's keep this conversation going.
Absolutely. Until next time, everyone, happy coding.